Ocarina of Time is one of the greatest games ever made, but did you know that it was originally planned to be much bigger? The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is often referenced as one of the crown jewel titles that many place at the top of the totem pole as their all-time favourite video game, and frankly, who can blame them? To this day, the game maintains a near religious following, and rightly so. All the magic and adventure that had once captivated players in A Link to the Past had been reimagined and translated flawlessly into a rich 3D world. The result? One of the most immersive and influential experiences the general public had ever encountered in gaming. Yet Ocarina of Time didn't just show up and coast on name recognition. It pushed the Nintendo 64's hardware to its very limits, dragging the machine kicking and screaming into the polygonal era, and in doing so, cemented itself as one of the most iconic titles of all time. But what if I told you that this grand adventure, this defining moment in video game history, was once meant to be even more expansive? Yes, today we'll be diving into the story of Ura Zelda, a mysterious and unreleased expansion to Ocarina of Time that promised to take Link's quest to even greater heights. I am Lady Decade. Hit that subscribe button, as this is another intriguing tale of what could have been. Ocarina of Time and the Zelda series in general consists of video games that were so groundbreaking that they have influenced pretty much every hitter that exists today. But what is just as cool is that I know how you can save up to 90% on thousands of titles, including even the most recent releases. Get 31% off Monster Hunter Wilds, 29% off Assassin's Creed Shadows, a ludicrous 47% off of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and money off pretty much any PC game you can think of. Grab a bargain and support my work simultaneously by using my affiliate link below. Happy shopping. Let's rewind back the clock to the mid-1990s, a period of massive transition within the video game industry. The 16-bit era was drawing to a close, and with it went the dominance of pixel art and the simplicity of side-scrolling. In their place, the newly released Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation were showcasing cutting-edge 3D graphics, much like a pair of smug show-offs at a technology fair. These consoles shifted their entire marketing efforts to highlight polygonal graphics, and suddenly games on the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo was starting to look like baby's first Fisher-Price toys in comparison. Now, believe it or not, Nintendo hadn't planned on trailing behind in this shift. Their own 3D-capable console, initially codenamed the Ultra 64, had been in development for years. But delays, internal shuffling, and a stubborn commitment to their proprietary cartridge format meant the system was late to the party. In the meantime, Super Nintendo fans were left to drool over tech demos and tantalizing gameplay footage splashed across gaming magazines and flashed up at trade shows. These previews painted a dazzling portrait of gaming future, with Nintendo positioning itself to strike back in spectacular fashion. In December of 1995, Nintendo took to the stage at their annual Space World trade event in Japan to show off a tantalizing glimpse of what the future might hold. What they unveiled was a short but striking demonstration reel for a project referred to simply as Zelda 64, an early concept of what would eventually become the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. The brief demo featured Link locked in a dramatic one-on-one sword duel with a towering armor-clad knight. Visually, this version of Link bore little resemblance to the youthful hero of Time we'd eventually come to know. His design was chunkier, edgier, and, frankly, more at home in a 90s heavy metal album cover than in the finished game. However, despite its rough edges, this early build generated a huge amount of buzz. The prospect of a 3D Zelda game on new Nintendo hardware, no less, was enough to get gamers foaming at the mouth. But while Nintendo was busy hyping up the Ultra 64, the console itself was already hitting technical and strategic roadblocks. A major one, Nintendo's pig-headed refusal to embrace CD-ROMs like Sega and Sony. While both the Saturn and PlayStation had moved to cheaper, higher capacity discs, Nintendo stuck rigidly with ROM cartridges, a format that offered lightning-fast data access but came with a laundry list of problems. For starters, N64 cartridges were eye-wateringly expensive to manufacture. Their storage capacity was laughably small compared to CDs, and to make matters worse, Nintendo was charging extortionate licensing fees to developers for the privilege of publishing on their console. In other words, they were simultaneously offering less while demanding more, a baffling move that left third-party developers cold. This wasn't about protecting the consumer or even about innovation, it was about control. Nintendo wanted to limit piracy, dominate distribution, and keep its iron grip on game production, but in doing so, they were effectively pricing out developers and shooing away talent. Or, to put it bluntly, they were cutting off their nose to spite a face. Still, as misguided as their decisions were, Nintendo did at least appear to realise they'd cocked up before the Ultra 64 had even hit store shelves. In a rare moment of humility, they began working on a solution, an add-on for the N64 that could finally support larger rewritable discs. Enter the Nintendo 64DD, a disk drive peripheral that promised cheaper storage, more space, and the kind of flexibility that developers have been begging for. With the 64DD on the horizon, the dream of bigger, more ambitious games seemed back on the table, including, as we'll see soon, an expanded Ocarina of Time. Since Zelda 64 was being positioned as the Nintendo 64's flagship title, the jewel in its polygonal crown, Nintendo assembled the biggest internal development team the company had ever seen up to that point. Over 200 staff members would contribute to the creation of Ocarina of Time, a staggering headcount for the mid-1990s when most game teams still comfortably fit inside a medium-sized pub. Given the scope of the project and its ambition to offer the most expansive, dynamic Zelda experience ever, the game was originally intended to launch as a title for the Nintendo 64 DD add-on. The DD's rewritable zip discs offered considerably more storage than a standard N64 cartridge, not to mention a real-time clock and a writable memory. Features that could have enabled more complex dynamic gameplay such as day and night cycles or persistent world states. But by March of 1997, the dream of a DD-based Zelda was already beginning to crumble. According to reports from IGN, Nintendo had officially shifted the development for Ocarina of Time away from the 64DD and back onto standard cartridge hardware. And the reason for this shift? Well, the game just wouldn't run properly on a magnetic disc. Satoru Iwata, yes, that Satoru Iwata, who was closely involved with the game's development, explained the technical shortfall in plain terms. ROM cartridges don't have any moving mechanical parts, so they read motion data in an instant no matter where it's stored. However, with a magnetic disc, it takes time for the mechanical parts to move around, meaning you have loading time while it's locating the data. As a result, we couldn't get Link's motions to work. He went on to clarify, if there hadn't been as many motions, we could have gotten the game to read them into memory from the disc in advance, but we had around 500 motion patterns. Translation: Link was simply too animated for the disc drive to handle. The poor lad had too many backflips, slashes, rolls, and sword twirls in his arsenal for the clunky disc drive to keep up with in real time, so once again, Nintendo's decision to stick with cartridges, though maddeningly short-sighted in many ways, had a surprising silver lining as over the course of Ocarina of Time's development, cartridge technology had continued to improve. High-capacity ROMs were becoming available and the engineering boffins at Nintendo were finding clever ways to squeeze more performance out of their own outdated format. In many ways, the 64DD's unique selling points, larger storage, rewritable memory, expanded content, were being quietly eroded by these. Add to that the 64DD's glacial load times compared to the instant read nature of the carts, and suddenly the expensive disk drive didn't look quite so futuristic at all. So, the cartridge may have been the underdog, but in the case of Ocarina of Time, it won the fight. In Japan, November 1998 marked a monumental moment in gaming history. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time finally arrived on store shelves, housed within a mighty 32MB cartridge, the largest in the Nintendo 64's library at the time. It was epic. It was cinematic. It was, for many, life-defining. But here's the thing, as jaw-dropping as Ocarina of Time was, what made it even more exciting, especially back in the late 90s, was a whispering promise that the adventure wasn't quite over because, as it turns out, what we played on cartridge wasn't the full story. You see, despite Nintendo's impressive advancements in cartridge tech, even their beefiest ROMs couldn't accommodate all of the features and ideas originally envisioned for Ocarina of Time. Certain areas, dungeon concepts and gameplay mechanics had to be pared down or outright cut. And the solution? Expansion. Nintendo still planned to leverage their upcoming 64DD hardware to offer something truly forward-thinking, downloadable content in the 1990s. Players would insert their trusty Ocarina of Time cartridge into the top of the N64, then slide a magnetic zip disk into the base-mounted DD unit. This Frankenstein setup, a sort of tower of power if you will, would allow the game to be expanded with new content. So enter Ura Zelda. Announced by none other than Shigeru Miyamoto himself, Ura Zelda was intended to be the first major expansion pack for Ocarina of Time. Not just a few cosmetic tweaks or a handful of extra enemies, this was to be a full-on remix. The expansion promised remixed, more challenging dungeons, tougher enemies, and even all new areas to explore. Miyamoto even referred to it as a sort of parody of Ocarina of Time, a twisted mirror image of the adventure we'd already played, where familiar places had unfamiliar dangers and dungeons would be redesigned to baffle even seasoned players. Needless to say, fans were hyped. The idea of getting more out of such a beloved game, especially with the promise of brand new dungeons, set imaginations racing. The cartridges may have had their limits, but thanks to the mystical powers of the 64DD, Nintendo had seemingly found a workaround. Ura Zelda wasn't just DLC before DLC existed, it was the chance to revisit Ocarina of Time through a whole new lens. Well, that was the plan at least. Eventually, after enough delays to make Duke Nukem Forever look punctual, the Nintendo 64DD limped to market in Japan in December of 1999. Years behind schedule, stripped of hype, and dropped into a marketplace that had already moved on. By the time the 64DD actually launched, it was no longer the revolutionary add-on it had been pitched as. Cartridge technology had continued to evolve, and developers had become increasingly adept at squeezing more out of ROMs. As a result, many of the 64DD's original promises were no longer quite as essential, and the cost-to-benefit ratio just didn't add up. So, in an attempt to salvage something, Nintendo quietly repackaged the 64DD as a niche creative tool aimed at Japanese hobbyists. Think Mario Paint, but with delusions of grandeur. This strategic pivot meant the device never even got a Western release, and in the end, the DD shifted only around 15,000 units, an absolute commercial disaster by Nintendo standards. Naturally, this spelled doom for most of the planned DD exclusive games and expansions. The SimCity sequel? Gone. The Mother 3 that was meant for the DD? Cancelled, and of course, Ura Zelda was now stuck in limbo. Still, even amidst the rubble, Miyamoto himself refused to officially throw in the towel. In interviews throughout 1999 and into 2000, he continued to claim that Ura Zelda was alive and well behind the scenes. Then, in August of 2000, he finally admitted what we'd all suspected. The expansion was, in fact, finished, and had been for some time, but with the 64DD a total flop, Nintendo simply didn't know what to do with the game anymore. What a kerfuffle indeed. And yet, the ghost of Ura Zelda still haunted Ocarina of Time. Literally, if you dug around in the code of the retail game, you'll find several leftover error messages referencing incorrect disk insertions. There's even a flag that marks save files as disk saves, and if manipulated correctly, a small disk icon will appear next to your save file on the file select screen. All subtle hints that Ocarina was at one point destined to interface with an expansion, one that never arrived. It's like finding a locked door in your favourite dungeon, one with no key, no way to open it, and no clue what treasures might lie behind it. As time marched on and the 64DD was quietly buried behind the shed like an unloved Tamagotchi, one of Ocarina of Time's other proposed expansions, Zelda Gaiden, began to take on a life of its own. Initially conceived as another 64DD project, Gaiden would ultimately break free from the add-on's gravitational pull and evolve into a standalone game using a modified Ocarina engine. And what was the result? The critically acclaimed, utterly bizarre and delightfully sinister Majora's Mask. With Majora's Mask stealing the spotlight and the 64DD in tatters, many fans understandably assumed that Ura Zelda had been quietly strangled with the same controller cable. A footnote in history, a cancelled dream. But then came a surprising twist. In late 2002, Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker for the GameCube, and with it came a special promotional bonus disc that stunned longtime fans. Included on that disc was the full version of Ocarina of Time, optimised for the new hardware, but more importantly, it also featured a second game, one long rumoured, often speculated about, and until that point never seen. What very much appeared to be Ura Zelda would be rebranded as Ocarina of Time Master Quest. Master Quest was in essence the remix Nintendo had promised years earlier. Every dungeon from Ocarina had been completely retooled to offer a more difficult experience. Area layouts had been altered, enemies were shuffled into far nastier positions, puzzle solutions were twisted, logic bent, and item placements moved just enough to make veterans second-guess themselves. It was Ocarina of Time, but weaponized. Hard mode? Pretty much. A master quest, if you will.
Got him!
And yet, even with Ura Zelda now seemingly released to the public, fans weren't convinced. For many, Master Quest felt suspiciously light for something that had supposedly been finished years prior. Where were the new dungeons, the new overworld areas, the Wind Temple, the elusive Ice Temple? Was this really the mythical Lost expansion we'd been teased with since the 90s? Or was it a cut-down consolation prize to shut us up and boost Wind Waker pre-orders? It was a thrilling release, but also a deeply suspicious one, and it left players with more questions than answers. So let's be honest here, Master Quest didn't exactly blow the doors off their hinges. It was fun, yes, clever in places even, but it lacked the heft and mystery that Shigeru Miyamoto had once teased with such enthusiasm. For years we've been led to believe that Ura Zelda was going to contain entirely new dungeons, new overworld areas, and maybe even new bosses, but Master Quest? It just felt like Ocarina of Time, but with the dungeon designer's toolbox flipped upside down. And so, as many gamers do when faced with ambiguity, a new legend began to form. One built on scraps of developer quotes, leftover game files, and an overwhelming desire for more. As time progressed in the early 2010s, a group of determined modders and ROM hackers decided to stop waiting on Nintendo and start building the dream themselves. The result was Project Ura, an ambitious fan effort to reconstruct what Ura Zelda might have been, based on speculation, beta content, and mountains of what-if enthusiasm. Eurogamer spoke with some of the team, including the project's artist and designer, Benjamin Walton, who helped shine some light on the thinking behind all of it. He explained, "There's a myth behind Ura Zelda based on interviews with Miyamoto and Iwata back in the 90s, that it would have been an expansion to Ocarina of Time, adding new dungeons and new overworld areas and new bosses. New everything. It's theorized that there would have been an ice dungeon, probably an ice temple, a wind dungeon, probably a wind temple, and who knows what else. But it really falls into the realm of speculation because there is no true confirmation." These theories weren't pulled out of thin air, mind you. Leftover elements in Ocarina of Time itself seem to hint at abandoned areas. For instance, Ganon's Tower features corridors themed around wind and ice, despite there being no wind or ice temples in the game proper. And the forest and water medallions, one looks suspiciously like a fan, the other a snowflake. Coincidence or evidence of a temple reshuffle during development? Some fans even theorise that parts of what was meant to be Hyrule Castle were repurposed into the Forest Temple, which would explain why its twisted architecture mirrors the regal stonework found around the castle courtyard. In short, Project Ura was a kind of archaeological fantasy, a reimagining of a game that never was, based on breadcrumbs and rumour. It wasn't an official restoration, there were no leaked design documents or hidden master builds. It was imagination and fandom, fueled by passion and pixel dust. And it was beautiful in its own strange, speculative way. In the years that followed, Nintendo would finally address the lingering questions head-on. It was none other than Shigeru Miyamoto himself who eventually confirmed what many had suspected. Ura Zelda, as it had once existed, had essentially morphed into Master Quest, but instead of creating entirely new dungeons to house their experimental puzzle designs, Nintendo repurposed existing ones, shuffling enemies, flipping layouts, and upping the difficulty to breathe new life into the familiar. So that was that then. Case closed. Ura Zelda was just Master Quest. Simple. Boring. End of story. Right? Well, not quite. Because in the cursed year that was 2020, while the world was falling apart, a different kind of chaos was brewing in the shadows. A massive, unprecedented breach of Nintendo's servers led to what the internet quickly dubbed as the Giga Leak, a colossal dump of internal developmental files, source code, and design documents spanning decades of Nintendo's history. For fans of Ocarina of Time, it was like the great Deku Tree had just spilled his deepest secrets onto the internet. Within this trove of forbidden knowledge were remnants of a very different Zelda. Buried among the files were references to entirely unused dungeon rooms, labelled in ways that made fans' eyebrows shoot through the ceiling. Some theorise that these rooms were designed for a boss rush mode, a gameplay feature later realised in Ocarina of Time 3D for the Nintendo 3DS, but never seen in the original N64 release. Even more tantalising was the naming convention of these files. Many of them were marked with DD in their file names. Some maps were specifically labelled 64DD, and not only were they unused in Ocarina, but they didn't show up in Master Quest either. In fact, a number of these assets later turned up in Majora's Mask, raising all sorts of uncomfortable questions. Were these assets meant for Ura Zelda? For Zelda Gaiden? Or were they leftovers from an early, grander DD-only version of Ocarina of Time? And then there were the enemies. Scrapped foes like what appeared to be an early model of an iron knuckle were found in the data. Now, yes, most video games have cut content, that's just par for the course. But when you've got entire dungeons, maps and enemy types labelled DD buried in the files of a game long rumoured to have a disc-based expansion, it's hard not to raise an eyebrow or two. So maybe Master Quest wasn't the full story after all. Maybe, just maybe, the fans who'd clung to their conspiracy theories for over 2 decades weren't just tinfoil-hatted weirdos shouting into the void. Maybe Ura Zelda was real. And maybe it still is. From its ambitious beginnings as a cutting-edge 64DD title to its ghostly resurrection as Master Quest and the tantalising clues unearthed in the 2020 Giga Leak, Ura Zelda remains one of the most intriguing what-ifs in gaming history. Don't forget that you can save up to 90% on thousands of titles, including even the most recent releases. Get 31% off Monster Hunter Wilds, 29% off Assassin's Creed Shadows, a ludicrous 47% off Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and money off pretty much any PC game you can think of. Grab a bargain and support my work simultaneously by using my affiliate links below, or if you want to back the channel in a more personal way, access my behind-the-scenes cosplay library and more via Patreon. I'll see you all again soon.